sorry, from it. Oh, I just got a recording in progress message there. All good. So I was born in Etobicoke, actually, to parents who had recently immigrated from Italy. So I grew up kind of learning Italian foods and Italian traditions, and I grew up that way. And then I eventually went to college, and I actually went to college for music, of all things, at Humber College. And having difficulty making ends meet, I started working in the restaurant industry as a server. I started falling in love with it, and I became more and more obsessed with food, and started seeing all the kind of my own how my own upbringing, it all kind of fit together. So I decided to start working in kitchens, because I thought I was going to open up a restaurant at the time, and I started working for free in a well-known kitchen, also known as staging. And I absolutely fell in love with it. They offered me a job, and I actually never looked back. And I worked my way through the ranks at different restaurants in Toronto, and I met my future wife, Marliese, along the way, and we worked together. Eventually, as Lori mentioned, I ended up at Le Select Bistro for quite a few years. Originally built in the 1977 and actually closed down recently. I was quickly promoted to the executive chef when I was there, and my family started to grow as well, and we had 3 children. And as that kept growing, my relationship to local food became stronger and stronger, and I started demanding more ingredients that were sustainable. And I started seeking out different farms, incorporating them into my menu, learning about heritage pork breeds, for example, and even keeping my own bees and harvesting honey from my hives. At this point, I was falling more and more in love with Prince Edward County, and with all its avant-garde winemakers, farmers, and chefs. I wanted to be a part of this community. And somehow, should fate have had it, I ended up meeting Greg Sorbara, who's a former finance minister of Ontario, who is also a local Prince Edward County resident, was restoring the Royal Hotel. And he also has a farm, which is him, his wife, and family operate, called Edwin County Farms, which is 650 acres of organic market gardens, maple syrup production, heritage varieties of wheats. And we hit it off, and it was like a dream come true. And they offered me the position at the Royal. And fast forward very quickly, we are aiming to open late this fall. I left a lot of little details out of there, but that's kind of a background of myself. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker to this evening, Keenan Sprague. Keenan Sprague is a lawyer and a 5th-generation canner at Sprague Foods in Belleville, working full-time in the family business since 2020. Keenan and I recently had a conversation over the phone after I met him through this for the first time, and I'm very excited to hopefully work with him in the future and perhaps do some of our own canning. I was thinking, how cool would it be if we could can our tomatoes from the Royal and have them all year round in the kitchen. Anyways, without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Keenan.
Thank you, Albert. I'm just going to try to share my screen here. It says the host has disabled. Oh, okay, opened up. That's good. Okay, and everyone can see that? Okay, so yeah, thank you, Albert. I wanted to address 2 main topics today. I was going to do a quick overview of the food processing sector in Canada generally, and then talk about some sustainability and climate change issues in the context of food processing and the food system as a whole in Canada. And my background is my family company, which is I'm 5th generation. I'm actually new to the company. I was a lawyer for about 9 years in Toronto. And so I'm still learning the food business myself, but I've got a lot of resources with that background. And we do mainly soup and beans now. We started in 1925 doing tomatoes and corn and peas. And of course, at that time, everything was local and organic because pesticides were still decades away from being invented. So it was a very different world back then. And I had the privilege of working with a lot of people whose parents, grandparents, and even great-grandparents worked at Sprague. So it's quite a lengthy legacy. So Sprague is within the food manufacturing sector in Canada, a very small piece of that sector. And that sector is the second largest manufacturing sector in Canada, just slightly behind auto. And as a food processor, we sort of occupy the middle of the supply chain. You've got this is a gross oversimplification, but it gives you a sense. You've got the producers on the farm, and then you've got the processors converting that raw agricultural product into whether it's finished food products or other ingredients. And then that finished product goes either to supermarkets, or it can go to restaurants like Albert's through food service. And we're actually talking in the midst of one of the most significant disruptions to the food system right now. The pandemic has really stressed our supplies in ways that no one ever foresaw. And looking back, it seems like we can understand why. Is for decades and decades, we've been building our logistics around this principle called just in time, which is meant to cut costs and drive to deliver a lower cost product to the consumer, avoid waste. But it's really the antithesis of a resilient food supply system. It's extremely fragile, we've learned, and the cascade effects of one piece of the supply chain affecting the next, and the implications of that are quite challenging. And so we're still having issues with supplies of ingredients and packing materials. So it's made it challenging. And the pandemic has also really underscored how food insecure Canadians are. When the pandemic hit, there was empty shelves on the grocery store, and there was a glut of food not being put through the normal restaurant channels, of course, because the restaurants were closed. So that was another challenge that was exposed, where our supply chains weren't really that flexible when we had truckloads of food going to waste and people going hungry because there's not enough food in the early months of the pandemic. I'm sorry to say that the Canadian food processing sector is in actually really bad shape. We live in a pretty much open market with the United States, and they have routed us. They have multinational food processors have preferred opening factories there. If you look in the last 10 years, they've just completely outrun us on new factory openings. Their share of GDP is much higher. We're actually losing jobs in food manufacturing. And it's even worse than that, because if you go and tour the facilities we have in Canada, they're just way behind the US in terms of capital upgrades and technology. And there's a variety of reasons for that. I imagine the United States does have a few natural advantages, being closer to crops with longer growing seasons, and they get the benefits of economies of scale with a larger market. But in my view, it's gone way too far, and we need to think about ways and policies that will help us reshore and rebuild our own domestic food processing sector, because just like we learned with the vaccines, if bad things happen and we don't have domestic manufacturing capabilities of food or vaccines, it causes a lot of problems. And we've all felt the pain of what that means in the context of vaccines. And if something worse were to come in the future and food scarcity became even a bigger issue, we would certainly want to have some domestic capacity to make our own food. And another contributing factor has been, we have a very consolidated grocery industry with a few companies dominating about 80% of the market. And that's created a real market imbalance where they are the gatekeepers to the market. And there's been a lot of unethical practices with how they treated suppliers, with no regard of Canada's wider interest in maintaining a healthy food processing ecosystem. It's really been slash and burn, and it's a tragic story that's gone on for decades, and that my family business has been witness to. But the good news is that in recent years, grocers, I think there's been a bit of a paradigm shift. And lately, we've had great success with the Metro Local program supporting local. We've had success with Costco and Sobeys and Walmart. But the best thing I've heard in the past year was the CEO of Sobeys, Michael Medlin, who actually was the former CEO of Canadian Tire. And he came to the industry sort of with fresh eyes. And last October, he was quoted as saying, "I wasn't used to the kind of relationships we see in grocery when I came into the business. I find some of the relationships repugnant, and some of them are just plain bad for Canada. Suppliers seem bullied, and it goes all the way down to the farmers and independent retailers. It discourages innovation and hollows out our suppliers." So when the CEO of one of the major grocers is saying this, that's quite validating. You know that there's a problem when the other side of the table is acknowledging that there's a real problem. So we're hoping that changes will be made to make a more hospitable and business environment to allow Canadian processors to rebuild and to make more of our food here in Canada. Now switching over to sustainability. Sustainability and food are synonymous. We've got a host of major problems in the way we grow food and the way we consume food, and it's not good. I was looking at our World in data, and said that around 26% of our total global greenhouse gas emissions are from the food system. We've got problems with pesticides disrupting ecosystem. If you remember the bee a few years ago, the bee issue, the mysterious problems with colony collapse. We've got another food waste issue, big food waste issue, and then we've got packaging. And those are just the ones I can think of. I'm sure there's other issues as well. This is a screenshot from our World in data, and it just breaks down that 26% of global greenhouse emissions that I mentioned. And food processing, actually, I was surprised. It was 4% of that 26%. But you can see that the majority of the emissions are occurring pre-farm gate, so before the product is leaving the farm. And a majority of that relates to meat processing, which is the most egregious of the issues. So I'm here just to describe the problem. I'm not here to describe how to change it. That's above my pay grade. But I just wanted to flag that it's significant in terms of contribution to emissions. And it's sort of out of line from what you seem to hear in our politics about where the sources of the problem is. You don't hear agriculture being identified that much. You do hear it, but so I just find that interesting. But not all foods are the same, and there's a big difference between plant and livestock animal emissions. And I'm happy that our business, our top seller, is our organic lentil soup, which is the lowest impact food product possible, really. And so of course in order to raise livestock, you're having to grow crops to feed those livestock. So it's an inefficient system. And by the way, I'm not anti-meat. I'm not a veg. I eat meat. Again, just identifying the problem. I'm not trying to be scoldy or tell people to stop eating meat. And I found this headline that more than half of our food produced is wasted. Like the global average for food waste is around 17%, and in Canada we're over half. So we're not pulling our weight by any means. We're buying our food for cheap, and then we're throwing more than half of it away. And I learned this just preparing for this talk. Canada didn't even have a food policy until 2019, which is remarkable to me since it has such an impact on food security and climate change. And in the policy itself, it says, why do we need a food policy? And it almost like I couldn't believe the question has to be asked, like, why do we need a health policy? Why do we need education policy? These are core interests of our society. Of course, we need a food policy. But you know, I think for food processing, there hasn't really been a champion in our politics because the grocers have been advocating for the status quo because they like to find their cheap food in Europe or US or Mexico or wherever. And then the food processing sector is dominated by multinationals who want to locate in cheaper jurisdictions with lower wage costs and lower regulations. So, and then of course the consumer is addicted to the cheap food, and in our business we know that price is key. So there just hasn't really been the impetus to reshore and build up our own domestic processing in our politics. But some good news, there's a lot of bad news. Some good news is the consumers are shifting their behavior in measurable and meaningful ways. And so there's growing demand for sustainable products, growing demand for health and well-being, natural, organic, and made in Canada. And it's actually been an accelerating growth. This is from between 2010 and 2020. And you can see that the organic natural category has gone from 11% to 18%. So things are changing. And then in terms of the plastic problem, I saw this earlier this year. Galen Weston, of course, president of Loblaws, the largest grocer in Canada, talking about how the plastic in our ocean will outweigh the fish, or soon outweigh the fish, and that each of us eats a credit card worth of microplastic each week. That was news to me. And that the packaged goods industry is responsible for 1/3 of that. So at our business, we've been courted by these companies that would like to sell us these, in quote, innovative packaging solutions, like the plastic retortable pouches or the cartons. But the cartons and the pouches have all of these layers of these synthetic materials, including plastics, and they say that they're recycling on the package, but they shouldn't be allowed to, in the sense that, as I understand, we don't have these facilities to actually recycle them. So they're ending up in landfills. So there should really be some government intervention on that to inform the consumer that what you're buying is going to end up in a landfill, and you could be buying something else. We still prefer the can. The can, unfortunately, we cannot source a can that's 100% made of recycled metal. It's I think it's around 40%. We're advocating our supplier to provide that option, but it's infinitely recyclable. And if it doesn't make its way into the recycling, it's not going to sit in the ocean for 10,000 years. It's going to corrode and go away. So yeah, just some takeaways. We've taken food for granted for many years in Canada. We've talked about how we're the breadbasket of the world, which we are. We export a lot of amazing crops, but we haven't. We've sort of lost. We haven't done enough to invest in our ability to add value, because from an economic perspective, it's a terrible deal to sell our mustard seed for a penny and buy it back from the state, finished mustard back from the States for $1. That's just a bad deal in economic terms. It's a bad idea in terms of our food sovereignty and our food security, and it's probably not great for the environment. And we really need to figure out this problem with agriculture and meat production, with the serious emissions that are going on. And I don't know the answers to that, but it's not sustainable. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Keenan. That was wonderful, very insightful. Our next panelist is John Thompson. John Thompson is currently the president of the Prince Edward County Federation of Agriculture. After working with OMAFRA, he became the third generation on the family farm, dairying until 2001, when he switched to producing broiler chickens, organic broiler chickens, that is, and field crops. I've had the pleasure of working with John on a couple of occasions, and have worked with his delicious, cooking his delicious meat. Welcome to the floor, John.
Okay, thank you, Albert. I was just trying to unmute and I think I succeeded here. Yes. So thanks for that introduction. I have something written down a little more detail, so I'll go ahead with my presentation, including introduction. Firstly, thank you to Don for inviting me to speak as a farmer at this meeting on food security in a world of climate crisis. For a brief introduction, I'm a third generation farmer returning home after getting a BSc Agriculture from the University of Guelph and working in Brantford for OMAFRA for the next 4 years. Jane and I have raised our family here, and son Kevin and his wife Jean have transitioned into succession as the fourth generation. On our farm on our one farm from the 1920s has evolved into 4 properties totaling 350 acres by the 1980s, with 150 acres of that being woodlands, grasslands, and the beginnings of the big swamp. We were dairy farming till 2001 and growing crops to feed the animals. We switched into chicken farming in 2003 by building a new barn facilitated by a new mortgage. Financing is an integral part of major capital purchases in today's farming world. Our experience with organic is that we were recruited from conventional chicken production to organic with a higher profit margin when Yorkshire Valley brand consisted of just 4 barns in production in 2011. The owners of the brand needed 4 more barns in order to have a weekly supply of fresh chicken for the large retailers such as Loblaws and Whole Foods. Each of us supplied the market for 1 week out of every 8-week cycle. And the cycle has continued to this day, except with a few more farms involved. Premium Brands is now the majority owner of this program. The higher retail cost of organic chicken is based on higher feed costs and other costs at each step of the process. So this product is not able to contribute to food security for the budget challenged consumers. However, the increased profitability has increased the viability of our farm as we have transitioned into supporting another generation, which now includes 3 grandchildren. I was asked to address the 3 subjects of exposure to organic, supply management, and regenerative agriculture, so I will move on to supply management. I have decades of experience in the system as both dairy and poultry operate under supply management. The public widely supports a strong Canadian food supply. Supply management supports and promotes domestic production and contributes to our economy without the need for government subsidies. The system matches the domestic production of these perishable products to consumer demand. Having an orderly planned system in which production is carefully calibrated to demand ensures that farmers and consumers are not subject to the boom and bust cycles which characterize the pre-supply management era. Canada places a cap on the amount of dairy and poultry products which can be imported duty-free. Beyond this base amount, effective tariffs are used to ensure that the import levels are predictable and can be factored into production planning. With governments having conceded so much in trade negotiations, Canada is now one of the largest per capita chicken importers in the world. Farmers through their provincial marketing boards negotiate minimum farm gate prices for their product based on fluctuating costs of production and a fair return to the farmer. Farmers do not set wholesale or retail prices. terms of benefits, supply management ensures that Canadian consumers have access to high quality, domestic produced, safe poultry and dairy products that are among the least expensive in the world. Secondly, it provides significant economic benefits to an extensive domestic supply chain from feed producers to processors. Thirdly, it allows farmers to be self-sufficient and profitable without relying on the taxpayer for support. Now for some comments about our farm and regenerative agriculture in general. There is no specific definition of regenerative agriculture, but there is a checklist of regenerative practices. A selection of these practices can be adopted on farms of all sizes and scale, in both organic farming and what is termed as conventional agriculture, but it's always evolving. We use our 200 acres of prime land to grow a 3-crop rotation of corn, beans, which are either soybeans or black beans, and winter wheat, followed by a cover crop. The wheat is harvested in late July, and the wheat straw is baled for use as bedding for the chickens. The manure from the chicken barn is spread on the wheat stubble to be base fertilizer for the following corn crop. This provides enough phosphorus and potash to provide carryover for the next 2 crops as the baled straw returns to the soil in the litter. After spreading the manure, we spread cover crop seed, currently oats, and disc the field to incorporate it into the soil to reduce the emissions and allow the cover crop to germinate. The top growth photosynthesis uses carbon dioxide, while the roots sequester carbon to support soil health and life. Cover crops also stabilize the soil for protection from erosion by wind and water. Combined with no-tillage planting of the corn, beans, and wheat, this rotation is our regenerative agricultural practices, which I will talk about in more general sense now. In the book, Growing Revolution by Professor David Montgomery, he notes that a growing movement of innovative farmers have laid the foundation for this revolution into regenerative agriculture. They are upending conventional ideas and changing practices in ways that leave the soil better off rather than worse off under intensive cultivation. This revolution can work on farms, big, small, high-tech, low-tech, conventional, and organic. Putting carbon back into the ground both removes it from the atmosphere, helping the climate, and improve soil health. Cover crops, nutrient management, and reduced tillage are key to increasing the amount of carbon stored in the soil. Professor Montgomery believes that of all our world-changing inventions, the plow was, and remains, one of the most destructive, making the land vulnerable to erosion by wind and rain. After all, it takes centuries to build an inch of topsoil. Changes in farming practices can transform both conventional and organic agriculture into more sustainable enterprises. To quote Dr. Montgomery again, erosion and degradation of soils and loss of organic matter are the most underappreciated environmental crisis humanity now faces. Once bare of protected vegetation and exposed to winds and rain, cultivated soil, bit by bit, slowly enough to be ignored in a single lifetime, but fast enough over centuries to limit the lifespans of civilizations. Rome didn't so much collapse as it crumbled, wearing away as erosion sapped the productivity of its land. Restoring soil faster than nature makes it can help address the fundamental challenges of water, energy, and climate. Raising the organic matter content of the soil increases water infiltration and holding capacity for more drought resilience, while offsetting a portion of global CO2 emissions. The positive effect of no-till on carbon sequestration is dependent on residue retention, cover cropping, and crop rotation, rather than just no-till planting on its own. Further soil health benefits are obtained on farms large and small when livestock production can be integrated into the system so that manure at agronomic rates can be worked lightly into the soil. Ruminant animals are especially beneficial as a large portion of their diets comes from perennial forages, which are superior to annual crops for soil conservation and carbon sequestration. Ruminant animals get a bad rap in the popular press because of their methane emissions as a greenhouse gas. However, methane is short-lived, changing to carbon dioxide and water in the presence of oxygen. A steady ruminant population would result in a steady amount of methane as the breakdown would equal the new emissions. Cows Save the Planet is another interesting book to read. It likely overstates the case, but ruminants play an important part in our food ecosystem as they digest forages, which humans and single stomach animals cannot, and produce highly nutritious meat and milk. Much of the land for this forage production is not suitable for annual row crop farming. Although estimates vary, agriculture is directly responsible for around 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So reducing fertilizer and diesel use by adopting regenerative agricultural practices could cut the agricultural sector's contribution to fossil fuel emissions by 5 to 10%. Add in an estimated 5 to 15% sequestration potential from the same practices, and we can estimate the potential to reduce or offset 10 to 20% of global carbon emissions. This is substantial potential if it was implemented over a large acreage. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you, John. That was very interesting. I'm particularly interested in the regenerative agriculture, and I went down a little rabbit hole last year, and I started reading I read a book by Gabe Brown called From Dirt to Soil, and that was quite an interesting book discussing the topic in detail. Our next guest is Stephanie Lang, who studied politics at Queen's, then worked on farms throughout Canada before starting Fiddlehead Farms with her partner, Heather. They grow vegetables organically on 10 acres in Prince Edward County and sell direct to consumers through a community-supported agriculture food program box and through Weekly's farmer markets. Welcome, Stephanie.
Hello, and thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and hopefully what I have to share about the story of our farm will be useful to everyone. I'm going to try and share just a photo slideshow to sort of illustrate some of my talking points. And I just seen I would need the host to enable my sharing abilities, if that is possible.
It is. Sorry, is it under Stephanie? I'm just trying to find you in the list here.
Yeah, Stephanie Lang.
Yeah.
I can wave if that helps.
Well, I can see you, but I can't see you in the list. I'm not why it comes up. It seems
they're not integral. I can start talking without the pictures.
It's at the top,
there
Laurie.
it is.
It's underneath Rick.
It doesn't help. Yeah, I got to find her in the list to make her. Here we go. Gotcha. I just put your name in. I couldn't scroll to you. Sorry about that. There we go.
Perfect. Let's see if this works. Share slideshow. There we go. It's just entering into the projection mode. There we go. So, Fiddlehead Farm. We're in our 10th year of production at this point. We moved here in the winter of 2012. We had been working up in Ottawa. Heather and I had met interning on a small organic farm at the time there. There's a nice little shot of us in the field with our dog to kind of give you a sense too of what our farm looks like. And I'd say we're probably unique in terms of the panel because we're really operating at a much different scale than a lot of the presenters before me. We're producing on only 10 acres of land. So 10 acres is our total production for everything we do. And as of this year, roughly 90% of our distribution is entirely through the community supported agriculture model, the CSA. And for those who are less familiar with the CSA model, the CSA is effectively a subscription food box. So people will sign up with our farm, and basically we're that families, that couples, that individuals, farmer for that season. They might get other foods too, but we're primarily growing most, if not all, of their kitchen vegetables. We facilitate that through an online platform that allows people to sort of customize what they want to have in their box each week. And we're growing in the ballpark of about 50 different crops over the course of the season in that 10 acres. You can see in this picture, we've got basil, bok choy, a cutting of arugula, lettuce in the background, a large cluster of weeds, which you can't really see because they're invisible, they don't exist, and then some of our brassica greens, I think, after that, and some zucchinis. So it's a lot. It keeps Heather and I quite busy. And we kind of got into this, I think, a combination of a passion for environmental issues, but also passion for food. We really love cooking, we love home cooking, we love playing in the kitchen. It sort of drives our passion for vegetables. But I would say along with that, we really wanted to try to build a farm that could be ecologically restorative, that could take a piece of fairly neglected and marginalized land and turn it around into something that was highly productive. The land we took over had been in hay for years, really low soil organic matter, very little was ever being returned to the fields. So this farm we started with was not the most fertile. And it took us a lot of years. We just got our recent test back. We've doubled our soil organic matter, which is an accomplishment, I think. But we want to try to double it again. So we're constantly working at trying to really improve the quality of the land that we're on and making it both more productive, but also trying to ensure that the ecosystem around the farm is at least supported, if not enhanced, through our activities. So I can talk a little bit about why we started this kind of farm. A bunch of different reasons. Some of them, we had no money when we started the farm. Farmland's super expensive. We were able to get some family help to finance a loan, to start a basic garden, worked off farm for the first few years, and slowly built up a business that could be sustaining as full-time employment for us. We also wanted to create full-time employment for our employees, which meant that we wanted to operate as close to 12 months of the year as we could. And so we facilitated that largely through doing a winter component to our food boxes. So we operate as of last year, partially because of our solution to the pandemic, 12 months of the year. We distribute food every single month. We do that with a combination of root cellars. So we actually, things like the sweet potatoes you'll see in the center, onions, garlic, carrots, beets, and much, much more, keeps really well for between 6 and 8 months in our storage units. And we basically are able to distribute that over the course of the winter months once the proper field system or field season has wrapped up. So we're trying to really fill that niche for people who want local food, who want food that is grown within a, I guess, with care to the nutrition, the fertility in the soil, grown organically without the addition of synthetics, and that is as healthy as we can get it for people. So yeah, we've been growing this way for a while, and we've tried to use it to sort of link into those passions. We're engaged with the Ecological Farmers of Ontario. I've also been involved with the National Farmers Union at various levels, and often are engaging in ways of trying to learn and improve our own practices to how we can make our farm better. We're currently moving to try to transition it to be lower dependence on tillage. So we're trying to move as much as possible with an intensive market garden model to be a no-till farm. And largely with this type of farming, we're looking at occultation using tarps to smother weeds and prevent weed growth, and just being able to make better use of the land. Yeah, and I think some of what Keenan and John had touched on in their presentations really applies to us. Part of the reason we're doing this is because we didn't see a future that was viable within the conventional food system, especially starting from nothing. We're first generation. Neither of us had farm experience before interning. So we've been doing a lot of learning on the fly. We've been doing this. We've had a lot of failures, a lot of successes. But we looked at that food system and we just felt it wasn't a place where we could, quite honestly, make a return that would keep us farming and that would provide us with full-time employment, especially on the land that we could afford with the resources we have available to us. So we've done the most that we can with fairly meager resources. And we've sometimes dabbled in moving closer to that mainstream market. But in all honesty, every time we've tried to, we've found it very difficult to adapt into our highly diversified system. We don't grow like a truckload of anything. But a lot of times when you're dealing with larger centralized distributors, you kind of need to be big. You need to be able to provide X number of this stably all the time. And we simply don't produce at that scale. To do that, we would effectively have to stop being a CSA farm and focus in on a much, much, much smaller handful of crops, which we've been fairly hesitant to do because to a large extent, that diversity of crops is what keeps us going. If one crop is having trouble due to specific pests, not liking weather in a given year, it gives us a lot of resilience to adapt to the climate challenges that year is presenting. Things that really love a lot of rain do well in those wet years, but our tomatoes, they're not going to be the best. And the same goes for our hot, dry years like we've been increasingly having. Some things do not do well in that weather. And because we're growing such a diversity of foods, we're able to tailor when and what we're growing. We don't grow some foods in the early season. Like we don't grow Napa cabbage in the spring. It basically melts in the heat, does not like summer in Ontario. But we plant it in August and we get beautiful, massive heads, very little fuss, very little worry. And that will keep in our storage. Well, I think we would probably until about late May, we'd be able to store that. So we're doing a lot on really trying to use the environment that we have, be nimble. We're using really marginalized land and turning it into something highly productive, which I think one of the questions I've been asked is this scale, is this type of farm, does it have a place in the food future? And I would say that's, I think, really where the key lies is we're using small spaces that large equipment doesn't do well in, and that monocrops don't do well in. Our land is really pocketed. There's some parts of it that I can't touch until June because they're sitting wet. Because we farm patches of it at a time, I'm able to use this fairly boggy, wet, underused piece of land to probably be one of the highest grossing per acre farms in our area, for certain. So yeah, I definitely think that there is a place. I think there's a lot of diversity that we need to see. I think small farms such as ours add a lot of that resilience that Keenan was sort of hinting at a little bit, where we're able to adapt and switch, whereas some industries or some players in the industry may find that more challenging. The more dependent and heavily invested you are in large equipment, the harder it can be to retool and reshift. Because all of our tools are multi-purpose and small, we're quite nimble at adapting to things like a pandemic. When the pandemic hit, we shift immediately from being a 50% farmers markets to being 90% to 100% CSA. And we were able to do that quite successfully with some challenges largely related to our workers not showing up, which is another challenge in food production. We were able to survive, but it also exposed those problems, like the fact that we need to bring up 2 women from Mexico every year to help us grow the produce. And that's largely because we've tried for years and we just can't find a stable labor pool to keep our farm going. At best, you might find someone who's inexperienced who will stay for a summer, and then you never have them back. There's no retained knowledge, no retained expertise. And our farm was at a breaking point where we were either not going to be able to keep going or we had to make a change because we needed that retained knowledge, expertise, and we needed to have people back each year who knew how our farm worked every year, because it's a ton of work. It's a frantic out the door. And when you don't have that knowledge, it's really difficult to do. I feel like I've probably gone over my time. Maybe Alberto.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was
Yes.
Thank you, sir. That was wonderful, and congratulations on your project. I love this type of farming and cooking with these vegetables, because you can taste the passion of the farmers definitely in the ingredients. And I feel like since I've moved here to Prince Edward County, I've always considered myself very in touch with local farms. At least I thought when I lived in Toronto. But I think I've been able to experience a new level of learning. And now our own family too we have a small family farm just to feed ourselves, but we do sell some honey as well. And I've definitely have so much more respect for everything that you do. So I'm going to try and there's a lot of questions. So I'm going to go back to the beginning and try to ask some of the questions. There's some interesting conversation regarding some indoor hydro grow up opportunities, which sounds fabulous. And then I think the first question I find here from Don Wilford is where does Sprague, so this is for Keenan, get its inputs from? What were the biggest supply disruptions, and did it result in changes to the recipes?
We are dedicated to sourcing as much of our organic produce from Canada as we can. We get all of our organic beans from Canadian growers, and we're now calling that out on the label. And the biggest supply issue would be the cans. In Canada, we lost all of our capacity to make cans here. So we're dependent on a few suppliers in the United States. And when the big boys need cans because it's a pandemic, the little canneries like us were lower on the priority list. So cans, it's a bad problem when you're a cannery and there's a shortage of cans. So it's very disruptive to our business, but we're working through it, and we're definitely through the worst of it. And our suppliers are great. They're expanding their capacity. So everyone's doing their best to pull through it.
Okay, great. Thank you. So this next question is from Diane Rayom. And I urge it was originally related to or directed to Keenan in his talk, but I also urge John or Stephanie to jump in as well, because I think this is a topic which is worth exploring. So the question is, can you expand a bit on how food is wasted to that degree?
So I would have a layperson's understanding on what I haven't dug deep on the research. I was just trying to point to the problem. But my understanding of wasted is just, clearing out your fridge because a lot of your food went bad and not finishing your dinner. And that might include waste in the process itself. So there's many opportunities for waste.
Different opinions.
I can jump in with a little bit there.
Go ahead, Stephanie.
So for us, we've had to deal with produce waste throughout the history of our farm. For us, doing farmers markets was a massive source of food waste, largely because it's a lot of speculation. So we would go to market with a speculative hope of what we would sell. And sometimes we would bring back a lot. Sometimes we'd bring back a little. Sometimes it would rain that day, and we would throw out half of what we took because you couldn't sell it. So there's a lot of waste just in that speculative nature. There can be a lot of waste in grading food as well. When you're like, oh, this has pest damage or this isn't perfect, we sell everything that isn't inedible, more or less, because we don't believe, like, we don't grade our food to that sort of rigorous standard. But that grading, that speculative nature of food, is a large part, I would say, of why for us we had food waste. And that's one thing the CSA has helped us with, is we throw out a lot less food because we're not speculating on what we're growing. We know what people have ordered that week, and that's the only thing that comes out.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead, John.
Sure. Yeah, I don't know a lot about food waste, but I've seen a lot of different numbers. You know, big numbers, high numbers, low numbers. So I don't know what to believe on food waste. That's my comment. He looks to be, he needs to unmute.
Let me,
You're on
let me-
mute.
I think you're
Yeah.
muted, Albert.
yeah, thank you. I am
There you are.
muted. That's a trick I've learned to do very well during this pandemic, talk with mute
Okay.
on. Okay, let me go down the questions here. And this question, I believe, John, was originally for you, but again, this is definitely applicable to everybody here. Question, this is another one from Don Wilford. How much carbon can farming sequester? Is it more or less than trees? And then the second part of that question is, do farmers need a government support, a program, excuse me, to support cover crops?
Okay, I don't have a number as to how much. I really can't answer that part. As far as the government program goes, it's yes, I would say yes, there should be. Apparently there's something in the recent budget, the federal budget, about climate change incentives for farmers, but it hasn't been fleshed out to the point that I really know much about it. Something about grants for more efficient corn dryers, grain dryers, whatever's more efficient, I don't know. And something about some help to reduce diesel fuel use, but I don't know what that would amount to really when your power engines are diesels. That's the way they're made. But yeah, there should be some incentives towards cover crops and other regenerative practices more than there are right now, I would say. Now, I did read that the USDA has just recently announced a $5 an acre credit on crop insurance if they're using cover crops, and that's a little bit of help. Bay of Quinte Remedial Action Plan has a $10 an acre up to 100 acres that a farmer could get if for cover crop seed if they're in the drainage area for the Bay of Quinte. It's not just that, just the seed and so on, because oftentimes it requires different equipment. There's something more specialized to be able to, certainly to plant no tillage, it's a more specialized kind of machine. So it does take some time and money to evolve your system and figure out the ways to do it economically. So some more help would be good. It would get more uptake.
Okay. And I guess, oh, yes, please, Stephanie.
So I think just to add to John on that, like the specialized equipment that he's mentioning, there's a lot of potential within intercropping, within row crops, underseeding, and a lot of things of that sort, that a lot of it requires specialized equipment to do. And that is a major barrier, I think, for a lot of farmers, is that capital costs. A lot of farmers already have fairly high debt loads. And so trying to do things that are climate positive, which involve taking on more debt but not necessarily seeing a profit yield for it, can be quite challenging, I think. ALICE, Alternative Land Use Systems, is a program in Ontario. There isn't a chapter, I don't think, in our area, but they partner with farmers. They're a nonprofit organization that works to try to pay farmers for some of the natural systems benefits that they can engage in. So in that sense, it is a type of program intended to pay farmers for making ecologically positive choices. And it helps with uptake of those things. And I think if anyone's interested in looking at their research, their numbers, they would be able to show you what some incentives have been able to do with farmers in the regions where those programs operate.
If I could just add to that, there was a talk on ALICE. Somebody, I guess the head of the ALICE organization, was invited to the county a couple of years ago, and he outlined the program. What we didn't realize, I would say, is that the money has to be raised locally. So they talk about these grants that be available, these programs and so on, and then say, well, you need to get together and raise the money locally. So
Could I just interject? I'm not an expert in this. I don't have an agricultural background, but my clear understanding is that our farms, and I'm not trying to, this is not an attack on farmers, but our farms are net contributors to emissions by a lot. And I think the question was premised on this, that how much is your farm sequestering, or how much carbon is your farm sequestering? There's no net negative farms, modern farms, as I understand it. And I'm just putting my ignorance out on display. Am I wrong? Can somebody refute that? To me, the question is, how do you mitigate the damage or the emissions that are being released? And that's a fair question.
Sure. Thank you, Keenan. Who would like to take that? John or Stephanie?
well, I think, yeah, someone else can jump in too, but Stephanie could afterwards. But I think that was part of my talk, was ways to raise the carbon content of the soils to mitigate emissions. And I did at the end mention some numbers of farming and agriculture in terms of global emissions, and it's significant, but it's not the major number. So getting more into the soil while using less tillage, less diesel fuel would be the direction. And I'm not sure we can get all the way to positive or not.
Getting more carbon into the soil.
Sorry, getting more carbon into the soil using the least diesel fuel, the least tillage. Regenerative agriculture is counting on the roots to do a lot of the tillage and to improve the soil structure by rotating the crops and putting in, leaving some on the top of the ground, like a cover crop after a cash crop sort of thing.
I don't like to jump in, but I do know the answer to this question, and I'd just like to help you guys out real quick. So whenever a plant grows, it collects carbon. And when it dies and goes into the ground, that carbon goes with it. So anything you plow into the ground, like a cover crop or anything you grow, sequesters carbon that's put back in the soil. And the more organic matter there is in the soil, the better the soil is. So it's it's a beautiful circle. It's just somehow or another we need to get in that circle. Sorry, didn't mean to intervene.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Thank you, Richard.
The cycle is it doesn't all form stable organic matter because oxidation, and it'll, the carbon will go back to the air again. So especially with tillage that's stirring up the soil, putting more oxygen in, you're losing what you just put down. So the ideal is to get a lot of rooting and some top growth, but not have to stir it up and cause a lot of oxidation.
I love the tech. Again, I'm going to go back to this not being an official farmer myself, but I'm going to go back to talking about this book, Dirt to Soil, by Gabe Brown, who's a regenerative agricultural farmer, and he also does a lot of grazing, interesting philosophies, and he talks about that, not tilling. He's very against tilling, and in fact, he also cuts down, like mows his cover crops, and then he plants directly into there. And I think if reading somebody like that, or listening to somebody like that, they're definitely in the right direction for sequestering carbon in that process. Stephanie, did you have anything to add on that topic, or should I move on to the next?
Because I think the question, like Keenan pointed out, was originally how much carbon can farming sequester? And I think the real answer is we don't really know. There's a lot of studies being done on a lot of different practices, but to my knowledge, we don't really have concrete scientific answers that would give you a specific number on the total percent or total amount of carbon. We know that there's ways to build carbon and do better, but as to what the actual specific number is, like I think intensive rotation on cattle grazing has gotten the most attention, and at least in my circles. And that's largely because it's trying to accelerate that cycle and moving the cattle so it's not depleting the crops over time by overgrazing them. And that's where they're looking at, a lot of people are starting to make arguments that that's where cattle farming needs to start moving with the ruminants to enable us to sequester carbon in the form of soil organic matter, but it's going to be at about a balance with the methane in terms of your greenhouse gas emissions. But as John pointed out, those are annual. If you can build soil carbon, you may over time have a net negative. But I think another positive in that is ecosystem restoration and ecosystem management with certain farming practices like intensive grazing. What's the name of the Alan Savory? What's the name of the researcher? Out of Africa looked at re-greening desertified areas and being able to turn them from a desert wasteland and using ruminants in highly intensive reef grazing periods to turn those areas into not necessarily lush, but productive grasslands that outside of the 2 or 3 weeks where they're getting grazed over are actively sequestering carbon, they're providing habitat, they're holding water in the soil. So they're able to restore a lot of fairly edge ecosystems, ones that are too dry to really do anything else with. And there's a lot of land in a warming planet that we can potentially reclaim through using livestock in that manner. But it will come at a cost of some higher methane, but you have the other benefits from that overall.
Thank you. I'm going to explore that name. I'm going to move on to our next question. Helen Fearman, I believe this was directed to you, Stephanie. How many people can 10 acres of food feed?
Ooh, good question. We, through our CSA, feed 400 families at our peak in the summer. And we do that over the course of the entire year. I would say that the actual number of households that we could feed is higher than that number because we do sell some stuff wholesale to restaurants. And unfortunately, there are some crops that just really don't like us. And no matter what we do, we'll have losses either because we just weren't able to get to them in time, we made a mistake, that sort of thing. So there's even more productivity in our fields. I would say my goal on our farm is to attempt to double what our current productivity is per acre. And I think that's a feasible goal. I know people who are doing, cheapers, they're doing like $400,000 on an acre. Not a lot of people are doing that. Those people are like crazy militants, but it's out there as a benchmark. That involves a lot of people. That took a lot of inputs to build up. But once it reaches a threshold level, they're really at a maintenance stage on the soil where they're adding very low inputs every year and just maintaining a high organic matter soil, largely through low tillage or no tillage. And that's kind of what we aspire to get to, is to try to improve what we're doing and how many households we're feeding. Whether that means we'll grow to be feeding 800 people or we'll just grow on half the land. I don't know what our future holds in that regard. We're kind of happy at our current size. But yeah, being able to grow more on less, that would be my ideal. And I think it's possible for us.
Thank you. I think this next question is going to roll right from where you left off there. From Don Wilford, do you use drip irrigation and how do you fertilize?
Yeah, so we do use drip irrigation. We use drip and overhead system with a sprinklers. Wobblers are supposed to have less drift spray.
I'm not sure if I'm frozen or Stephanie's frozen.
I think Stephanie's frozen.
Okay,
Yeah, Stephanie's frozen. Yeah.
let's give her a second.
Oh.
Hopefully. Oh, she's back. So Stephanie, I think the
I
last
think
thing
I'm
we,
back. Did I cut out
yes,
there?
yes, you did. I think the last thing we caught was the wobblers are supposed to, I think, prevent. I'll let you continue.
Perfect. My apologies. I am on internet in the country. So, yeah, the impact sprinklers generally create more of a mist drift spray. So we're constantly conscious about trying to conserve water. We've started to move more towards an overhead system for irrigation, largely because we don't like the amount of annual waste that gets produced with the drip tape. Drip tape, for better or worse, often has a 1-year life cycle on it. Sometimes you can stretch it to 2 years, but 9 out of 10 times, we try to use it a second time, it's just a nightmare patching holes and tears and rips in the tapes. And you're spending way more time and effort than you have available to you in a pinch season. So we don't save it. And so that's landfill that we're generating that we're not happy with. So my ideal would actually be have everything on the overhead sprinklers that I can, and as little as possible in the drip, just because the wobbler system, once I buy it, that system, in theory, that should last me for decades, because those parts are highly durable. I might have to replace the odd sprinkler here and there because, you know, someone stepped on it or it fell under a tractor tire, but which should be more durable. So drip is really good for conserving water use at source, but I have problems with what our upstream costs are on the drip tape because it takes so much to produce that plastic every single year. And the plastic that goes into making a durable over time overhead system is easily comparable to what we would go through in just 1 year with a drip system. Oh, you're muted again.
Oh, I like, that's my trick. No, that's very interesting. I actually, in our own family plot, installed drip tape. Now maybe I'm regretting it for this year. I thought I'm going to do it, but I bought apparently a more durable, thicker one from Dubois. So they said I could use it for a few years. We'll see.
It does depend a bit too on what the crop is. Like some crops just really don't like getting wet. Like anything
Right.
that's in the Solanaceous family, like your eggplants, peppers, tomatoes, they don't want to be watered from overhead. So no matter
Okay.
what I do, we're likely looking at those always being
At the drip. Got you. Okay. Our next question from Lori, I believe, also for you, Stephanie, but I think John can chime in here too, for sure. Stephanie, do you have a plan? Do you have to plan succession planting? For instance, planting one crop right on top of the previous?
Yeah, so we highly intensively crop our land off. Number of sections will get 2 crops. Sometimes they'll get 3 crops per year. Short crops like lettuce and cilantro, that type of thing, will only be in the ground for about 4 weeks. We start everything in the greenhouse as a seed start to minimize time in the field. And more or less that 10 acres as of about now in the year is fully planted, and when something comes out, something new goes in. And so part of what I do in the winter is I have a lovely, enviable job of staring at spreadsheets for weeks on end, planning out what's going in, when it's going in, how the succession's lining up. And we're constantly seeding new crops nonstop through the year. And yeah, so we're constantly recropping and making as much use of the land we have. Some crops are in the ground for the whole season, but a lot of them aren't.
Thank you. John, did you want to add to your succession with crops?
I guess we would call it double cropping, and in this part of Ontario, not much of that happens. In terms of market crop, we really can't do it. In the extreme southwest, they will maybe get some wheat off soon enough at the end of June and plant soy, but get a double crop, but not really here, with the exception of the cover crop, because after the wheat's off mid-July type of thing, it's time enough to plant a cover crop. We spread our manure and plant the cover crop, but we don't harvest for cattle feed. If we had cattle that we needed to feed, we would plant that cover crop as early as possible and be focused on something that would make a forage that could be harvested as a wet feed, perhaps end of October or something. But we're not in that business, so we're just growing it for the land.
Thank you, John. Okay, so the next questions here, I think some of them were answered throughout the dialogue. Questions: county soils are poor. How have you amended your soils? Does anybody, John or Stephanie?
Yeah, I could jump in there. So largely the county soils are, I think depends where you are as to whether or not they're poor or not and how they've been managed. For us, the closest and most abundant source of fertility for us has been the mushroom plant. It's abundant. It's a local resource that is inexpensive for us compared to, say, trucking in a comparable soil amendment from, somewhere really far away at more than triple or quadruple the rate. It just made sense for us, especially as we're in a project of trying to really build our soil organic matter. It was just an affordable source of organic matter. We're currently working to bring new fields into production so that we can start incorporating a heavy sort of a cocktail cover crop rotation in with our vegetable gardens. That basically meaning that every year we'd have a full 5-acre block that would be in intensive cover crops. And when I say cocktail, I mean it's a mix of different seeds. The idea being that different plants occupy different strata in sort of the field. And what we want is to have every single space in that biota occupied so that when we turn it in, we're getting as much organic matter into the ground as possible. And then as we're trying to move more into a no-till system, we'd likely be smothering that down after turn down so that it would get worked in for the next year's crop and trying to use that as a main way. And I think for us, not taking a crop off is really important, because when you do take that crop off, even if you're returning organic matter, the grain or whatever that crop you took off is, that has removed nutrition from the soil. And so it's not, if we're trying to build fertility, it's kind of a trade-off to try to steal a little out of it at the same time. We also buy in a organic pelletized fertilizer to try to augment our system a little bit as well. It comes out of BC, and it's just like I think it's a turkey litter product, and we mix that with various together with different sort of types of that, as well as using some carbon mineral or pellets as well to try to lock up as much as we can into more complex organic structures, trying to feed the biology in our soils as much as we can, trying to view the soil as a biological entity as opposed to a medium.
Soils. Do you want another comment on soils? That our soil is not poor. It's been managed for decades. We do soil sampling every third year. We rotate through, so we're doing some soil sampling every year, but each field every third year after wheat to monitor particularly the phosphorus and potash levels. And we spread chicken manure, which is very high in phosphorus, so we can maintain our levels in a good agronomic range with the chicken manure and with buying some phosphorus and potash especially for starter fertilizers from the farm center. And we don't have to use big quantities, but we want to use enough that we're replacing the nutrients that are removed from the soil.
Thank you. So I think we have time for one last question. I just found a question which I think will apply to all three of our panelists today. The question was from Don Wilford. Keenan, if you want to start off with this one. Question: obviously your customers are prepared to pay more than in the store. how much higher are they willing to go? I think that's related to organic or natural products. Keenan?
Yeah, well, yeah, of course it depends. There's different markets, different market segments, and you know, we know that people who have bought these organic type products historically have been shoppers in the higher end. You know, the challenge for our company is to make healthy living affordable, and we're big believers in the power of organic food for overall human health. And by doing it at scale and by sourcing local Canadian farmers, crops that are growing organic at scale, which has really taken off in recent years, we're able to drive the cost down. So we try to bridge that challenge of bringing down. That's what canned foods is really good at, is making it more accessible, but doing it in a quality way. And I would be remiss if this is, I just want to make this last point, how much respect I have for Stephanie after listening to her talk about her operation. Everybody on this call should understand how much hard work what she's describing. Like it's mind-boggling. So great work.
Thank you. It's true. I think that can be said for many farmers, and including John as well. Yes. So Stephanie or John, would you like to answer the question?
Go ahead, Stephanie.
Okay. This is one thing I think we've often wrestled with when we're trying to figure out our prices, because ultimately the way we do it is we basically break down how many hours a year we have to harvest our food. And then we look at what we need to basically make a livable income for Heather and myself to take out of the farmer's profit, as well as, you know, pay all of our employees. And so that really sets a benchmark as to what we need to be picking at. And so that sort of sets what our minimum price for an item is. And we won't sell anything at a loss, because it doesn't work for us to do that. Every square inch of the field needs to pay for itself with what we're doing. But despite that, because we are filling the middle role of the grocery store by doing the distribution ourselves, we're able to capture a lot of that value that ends up being taken up by the grocery chain. So when we go to the grocery store, we're always sort of taking a look at the produce section and trying to keep in mind, like, we want our prices to be accessible to people. We don't want them to be getting gouged. We don't want them to feel they're getting ripped off. And the odd item that we grow may be more expensive than you would get in the grocery store. But I would say the vast majority of what we do is either on par with often not organic produce, and is sometimes less expensive. Sometimes we'll up the price if we see that we're way off the mark, because, you know, we'd like to earn a little bit better of a living than we do. But we're always playing that balancing game of trying to make sure that we're as accessible as we can be, because we do know, like, we cater to probably a more affluent clientele. I think a presentation I watched on CSA's statistics that was based on numbers in the US, the vast majority of people who were members, I think it was like 60 or 70%, something in that ballpark, had graduate degrees who were members of CSAs. And so being mindful of that and wanting to appeal to a broader demographic is really key to us, because we really want people to eat good, nutritious, and fresh food, like food that is out of the ground, off the vine, a day, 2 days at most when they actually get it. That's our goal. We're trying to do it to keep it within the price point. And I would say, yeah, sometimes it's higher, but 90% of our product, I would say, is on par or less.
Okay, I guess it's my turn. It's easy because we're price takers, not price setters. We sell corn, beans, wheat. Some of it's pre-sold before harvest, and some later, the rest later. It's just what the market is paying. That's the way commodity agriculture works for the crops, the field crops. as far as the chicken goes, it's a contract with Yorkshire Valley to sell our chickens. So they do the selling. They offer a price. They will give us a price, and it's a decent price, and that's what we get. And then they sell to the retailers for I don't know how much. That's their business, and the retailers mark it up. I have no idea how much. That's their business. But I would say our chicken is selling about twice the cost of a regular commodity because of the organic, certified organic, and it's a niche market. They can get it. If it was a huge market, they wouldn't be able to.
Less of a niche all the time, though.
Less of a niche, you say.
Less, yeah, maybe less of a niche, but
Yes.
if it's priced high, it'll stay as a niche, I suspect. It's been growing somewhat, but
Well, thank you, everybody. That was wonderful.
Well, that was a very insightful discussion. I learned a lot, and I just want to thank you, Chef Albert, for reading through all those questions so well and adding so much of your own knowledge in farming. One thing that's really struck me is just how hard each of the people here tonight on the panel have worked to make their farming the most earth friendliest, building their soil in the way that they can. I think sometimes people try to vilify the large farmers or manufacturers, and I think that we need to look at how hard each person has been working to do the best they can with the climate that we have, and without real government help. I think that that's someplace that the government could get more involved to support. And as for like Keenan and Sprague Foods, the ability to manufacture foods here for us to eat is very, very important. And the fact that most of this manufacturing is going to another country, with these delicate supply chains, it can be definite, as we saw during the pandemic, very problematic. So I feel like there should be more supports as well for these manufacturers. And I will just say that Sprague Foods is a guilty pleasure of mine. Not guilty, an unguilty pleasure. I enjoy it so much. Anyway, I thank you all for your time tonight. It was really insightful. I learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else did too. And I really do appreciate you all taking the time to share your knowledge with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.